Okay, so thanks for joining us this afternoon and taking the time out of your busy schedules to book a session on this webinar. It's going to be an interactive session, so there will be an opportunity to ask questions, which will be answered by Peter. I'm assuming, Peter, will you do it at the end, or can you answer questions during the webinar?
I'll take them all throughout. Feel free, everyone, to type in questions. There's a Q&A panel in Zoom. Feel free to type in questions at any point. I've got that up in a separate monitor. I'll pay attention to it, so don't feel like you need to wait till the end by any means.
Great. Okay. Well, today's webinar is hosted by myself, Steve Henson, Head of Customer Accounts at Blackstar, and our Head of Marketing, Dylan Pepler, along with Peter Hornberger, VP of Product at Brightmetrics. Today's webinar, Changing the Game, is the second of 3 sessions that we're hosting with Peter. And if you missed the first, it's already available on Blackstar's YouTube channel. So take a look at that. Details of the third webinar will follow for a date early in the new year. Now, for those of you on the call today who don't already work with Blackstar, I'll give you a very quick overview before we start the webinar. We're a trusted business communications provider who work closely with our customers to supply them with innovative solutions from a portfolio of best-of-breed vendors. Our services include fixed line and business mobiles, connectivity including LAN, WAN, and Wi-Fi, on-premise, hosted, and hybrid telephone systems, along with solutions such as Brightmetrics, which provide our customers with valuable insights into their performance and productivity. And we'll get a chance today to look at the Radiance user interface, which is used to gather that data. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Peter so that we can get the interesting part started, and we'll follow up with any questions during and towards the end of the webinar. Over to you, Peter.
Great. Excellent. Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. Nice to virtually meet you, I guess. I guess first thing, kind of slide I always want to throw up is names and faces. So you can see that's Steve at the top. That's me at the bottom, VP of Product at Brightmetrics. And I know Steve alluded to, this is the second in kind of a 3-part series that we're doing. The one thing I will say in that is, if you didn't make it to the first one, don't run away from us today. This one will still be valuable. It is something that can stand on its own, does not require knowledge of the first one. So don't feel like you're playing from behind if you didn't see the first one. I would highly encourage you within that, do go check out that YouTube video if you haven't seen it, the 5 metrics to master customer success. It's a really, really great webinar that walks through some key analytics and practices. From a top level, I really want to kind of dive straight into our topic today, but I will talk to you a little bit about where we're headed with it. From a top level, if you're not familiar with Brightmetrics, Brightmetrics is a data and analytics platform that overlays with what's today called the MyTel MyVoice Connect system, obviously formerly the ShoreTel system. We've been in this space for about 10 years at this point. And what we really specialize in is full suite analytics, dashboards and reports. You're going to see examples of this today as we run through some of our metrics. And specifically, one of the areas that we engage quite a bit is an area that we broadly call contact centers. And some people really shy away from the term contact center. When I say that, they think, oh, I don't have ECC with my MyTel system, and so I don't need that, or I don't have 500 people in a warehouse just handling calls all day. That's not me. And one of the things I always like to do in kind of table setting as we walk into one of these conversations is reset that. The term contact center has this connotation that implies these very, very large, almost sweatshop type customer service environments. And at Brightmetrics, we think that that's wrong. Really, a contact center is any time that you are intelligently routing calls that come into your system to a team of people. So if you take inbound calls and those calls do anything besides go directly to individuals when they come in, you have a contact center. Let me make that even more practical for you. If you have a MyTel system, there's one of 3 ways that you can route calls within your system: hunt groups, work groups, and enterprise contact center. All 3 of those function like a contact center. A hunt group might take calls and field it to 2 people. Even though that's a very, very small one, that's a contact center, and so forth. So as we kind of talk through this, I know that some of the marketing that we put out around this and some of the terms that you'll see in here are contact center specific. Don't shy away from that. That still very much and absolutely applies to people that are running in these kinds of environments. And that's where we specialize, whether you have hunt groups, work groups, ECC, or even we might have some people on today that are using bridged call appearances to replicate old key lines. Even those function in the same way. What we really do is give you an easy way to take a look at everything that's coming into one of those areas and figure out how is the team performing, how are my customers and my callers responding, and what could we do to either be more operationally efficient or better satisfy our callers. And what I really want to hone in and focus on with you today is employee performance as it pertains to that. So a lot of times the metrics that people pay attention to around their customer and caller satisfaction, around their operational efficiency, have to do with things outside of an agent's control. So for instance, what's the total volume and what percentage of that call volume is hanging up the phone? Those are things that a lot of times agents don't have a ton of control over. If an agent's just doing their job day in and day out, they don't necessarily have control over how many callers hang up or what the total volume is, or the fact that you're very busy at particular times during the day. We talked a lot about those kinds of metrics in the last one. Today, what we're going to take a look at is this idea of gamification as it applies to your team. How can you use data and analytics to get your team to a position where they're maximizing their output without you having to push or poke or prod as much as you might think? Here's a quick kind of rundown of our agenda today. We're going to walk through 4 main sections. We're going to talk about definitions. We're going to look at some benchmarks. We're going to talk about communication and feedback. I'm not one to spend a lot of time on these agenda slides, so let's just dive right into step 1, definitions. What are we really talking about today? The term gamification is one that I think has a lot of preconceptions made around it. So when I say gamification, that's a really popular term in the enterprise world that gets into these very complex programs where you've got your entire team on a ship and they're all collecting rewards and badges and competing with one another in some fancy tool that is showing them where they sit on the leaderboard and so forth and on and on. And that's kind of the image that a lot of times comes into people's heads when they hear gamification, like very, very complex enterprise level software applications. That's great. That absolutely is gamification. It's also overkill in a lot of scenarios. When you really break gamification down to its basics, to its kind of base level, what is gamification? Well, I would pose this definition. Gamification is encouraging your employees to self-manage and compete on their performance through transparency and visualization of data. That's really, really key. At the end of the day, those gamification systems have a really, really fancy skin over top of data that is telling them what's going on with a team of people. So when you get into these fancy kind of, it's like everyone's on a board game and moving and collecting badges and earning rewards and so forth. At its base level, there has to be some data that tells those kinds of systems, when does someone advance, when do they collect a reward, and so forth. And so if you strip it back as the data analytics person, the first key to a successful gamification strategy, really getting your team to work on their own, see their own performance relative to their peers, and self-manage their output to drive performance. When you really get down to the basics of it, it requires first really strong data. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is that data component. Your system, if you have a phone system or a contact center system, your system collects so much information about your employees and their performance. It's one of the most valuable things in modern phone systems and modern contact center systems is the amount of data that collected. Look, I'm a data person, but selfishly, I think that more than half of the ROI of those systems these days is the amount of information that you can gather and collect and what you can do with that. And so that's what we want to talk about today and really dig into is what's going on here. Here's a quote that I really like about gamification. This is from a company called Bunchball. I mentioned that you know, there are these enterprise applications. Bunchball is one of those. I have some experience with them from a former life, a different company that I worked at. I won't read the whole quote here, but I really like, you know, you can read through this. at some point. We have a white paper that follows up that also includes this. They highlight a couple key things in here that I want to touch on that'll kind of help define where we're headed today. Gamification is all about guiding and increasing high performance activity, and the way to accomplish that is using real-time feedback. Those are the two main things that I really like in this quote. And I'm going to talk to you about both of those today. I think those are crucial points: real-time feedback and identifying those high value activities. So you might say, great, I'm sold, I'm bought in, Peter, this sounds excellent. I want to build out a gamification strategy for my organization. But I have no idea where to start. What should be the measurements that I'm trying to encourage my employees to improve and change and manage around? Well, I'm really glad you asked. The truth is that's one of the most important things. Is you might be able to develop a very, very strong gamification strategy and have a whole program and have some kind of an incentive tied to it and so forth. But ultimately, if you're doing all that and measuring the wrong thing and not actually measuring something that's going to have an effectiveness or a change in the way that your business runs, then all of that is want for nothing. So ultimately, that's the first thing I want to talk to you about, is figuring out what you should be measuring and how to set goals. One of the things that I want to talk to you about a little bit within this one is where the responsibility lies within the organization, and what are the different measurements that you should be paying attention to within those various segments in your organization. And so, this is just a little bit of a pyramid. We're going to come back to this a little bit later and walk through some components here, but this pyramid is really a great example. Look, a very just simplistic sort of an org chart. I'm going to talk to you about 3 different levels of an organization. I understand that organizations are not typically 3 levels, but when you look at kind of call center and contact center organizations, typically there's kind of 3 levels of management within that. You've got your agents down at the bottom, your contributors. You've got your kind of mid-level management, your supervisors, your managers, and then you've got your executives, your directors, your executives, and so forth. And so just kind of keep this picture in your mind. It's going to become important as we run through them. So on the topic of what to measure, there's a lot of things that you could measure, but I like to break the potential measurements into 3 buckets. I will say this is a list that I think is a really, really good starting point. If you have no idea what to measure, here's some things that you should absolutely start with and pay attention to. This is not comprehensive. There are other measurements you can pay attention to. So, this is a great example of a case where I'm going to give you a bunch of ideas, but if you look at this list and say, well, here's another thing I like to pay attention to, don't shy away from that. That might actually be a good thing to pay attention to. I pulled together a list of what I think are the most common and most popular and some of the easiest ones to get at. I break them into 3 buckets: customer experience, efficiency, and ability. Let's just walk through them one by one. Customer experience. So when we talk about calls coming into your organization, one of the things you want to make sure is that the person that caller is connecting to is having a consistent and reliable experience that shows your business in the light that you want them to. Obviously, there are a lot of things that you could do there to monitor that. You could do things like record the calls and actually jump in and spot check and listen to those. So that's one way, but that frankly is a big lift for a lot of people. That's something that isn't possible for everyone. So from a measurement standpoint, you could look at things like average handle time or average hold time or % of calls transferred. Those are 3 things that are easy to measure and monitor, and they're really interesting measurements to pay attention to when you start to benchmark your team against one another. This is actually one where we went in deeper onto the transfer rate and the average handle time in the 5 metrics webinar. You can refer back to that if you want to learn more. But long story short, if you have a pool of agents or a team of people, let's say you have 10 different people and they all have the same skill function, job set, training, and so forth, they should be exhibiting very similar numbers when we look at something like average handle time and percentage of calls transferred. If your team is escalating calls, let's say that they escalate 10% of the calls. If one of those agents is escalating 20 or 25%, That's a huge problem. That's a big deviation. Why are they different? What's going on there? The same thing with average handle time. Someone's spending too much time on the phone, they're not operationally efficient for you. On the flip side, if they spend too little time on the phone with the caller feels what they don't like, they're not getting what they need. Everyone hates being set on hold. That one's fairly easy to understand. So these are some measurements that you can kind of look at and start to pay attention to and see, okay, this particular measurement is something that seems to be erratic. If you jump in and you find that your average hold times are all over the place, maybe that's one where you can make a difference. Or maybe you jump in and you find out that your group average is something like 6 minutes per call. Well, in that case, maybe that's the number that you just identify and say, hey, we want to drive that downwards. Or same thing with handle time or transfer rate, things like that. Those QA spot checks at the bottom, that would be more of that recording and actually listening in and creating some kind of a program where you're checking in on a few different calls throughout the day. Second bucket, efficiency. These are things that don't necessarily drive customer experience, but are more about how proficient is this agent or this person at their job. That's things like how many calls did they take or make throughout the day? What was the percentage of calls that they answered? So how many times did their phone ring and what number did they answer? If you're using contact center applications, what's their wrap time? What is their wrap code adherence? Do they actually use wrap codes the way they're supposed to? What's their idle time? Idle time is something to be really careful with. If your team doesn't have any control over the inbound calls and they're not responsible for making outbound calls, idle time is not necessarily something in their control. But if you run a sales team or some kind of environment where there's a mix of both inbound and outbound calls, the agent absolutely has control over how much time they're not working or not on the phone throughout the day. So that can be a really interesting measurement to pay attention to. So again, be careful with that one. But if you run more of an outbound environment, it's a great one. And the last section is ability. This is just things like, do they know how to use your system is kind of where I go with this. What's their login time? What's their, what events are they driving? If you're using contact center, when are they going into release? What release codes are they using? That's, two kind of things in there. Are they in their seats when they're supposed to be? So, that's kind of time cards type stuff. But second to that, do they know how to use the system appropriately? Things like if you get into an advanced call center application, pay attention to forced releases. If that's happening a lot, that means a lot of people are missing calls. And in that case, you want to kind of see some corrections around that. And you could pay attention to things like percentage of time spent on break or percentage of days spent logged out. There's all kinds of measurements that you could wrap around that. Now, here's one of the most important things. I just gave you a list of around 10 different measurements. 10 measurements is way too many things for your agents to focus on improving at once. So I don't give you this list to say that every gamification strategy should include all 10 and probably the other 5 that you thought of while I was walking through that. What you want to do is identify and figure out what your big wins are. So go and take a look at these measurements. And one of the easiest ways to go and take a look at these measurements and get a feeling for where you could make a difference is think in your mind right now. If you manage a team of people, I guarantee if I say to you, who's your top performer, you have a name that rises to mind. You know, just instinctually, there's something in your gut that tells you, hey, this person's my best employee right now. Go take a look at that person's measurements in all of these different aspects and then compare that person to the rest of your team. It's a really interesting way to kind of try to get a feeling for, is there some sort of metric that sets this person apart? And what is that? And what you want to do is try to hone this list down to 2 or 3, maybe 5 on the top end, but I even think that's too much, key measurements that you feed into your gamification strategy. Let me give you a really practical example. We have a support manager here. Her name is Michelle Sucre. If anyone on the call has ever done a demo with us, you very likely have met Michelle. Michelle's wonderful and excellent. Her past, before coming to Brightmetrics, she actually used to run a call center. And one of the most interesting things that she did at that call center, and she did a lot of interesting things there, but one of my favorites is she implemented a program there for their agents called the STAR program. Now, again, remember, I'm saying call center, they had a very large call center actually, but again, this kind of a program is something that you could run with a 2-person hunt group if you saw value in doing so. So again, I'm going to say call center a fair amount, but I don't mean those large call centers by any means. What was going on with Michelle's organization is they're really focusing on organizational efficiency. They're trying to figure out how to make their team more productive. And so they grabbed a handful of measurements and tied them together. They have specifically paid attention to 4 primary things. They looked at average handle time, and they set a target based on some of their analysis and measurements that they wanted their their agents spending 190 seconds or less on average per call. So they wanted handle time less than 190 seconds. They took a look at their schedule adherence. So were people sitting in their seats when they're supposed to be? They wanted them at 95% or higher in terms of adherence. So that has to do with breaks and vacations and working time and so forth. And then they took a look at total number of calls handled, and they looked at calls transferred. So they had this, very kind of simplified program where they said, hey, here are the key metrics, and they set benchmarks around each one of those. I simplified that a little bit, and I made it 5 measurements to give both people who are running hunt groups and work groups or people who are running ECC groups some examples. So here's our example kind of STAR program. I took Michelle's template and I broke it out into something that's kind of easy for us to play around with today. What we've got first is under the customer experience side, I've got average handle time. So we want to pay attention to that. We're going to dig in. We're going to look at that actually within some kind of live data. Under efficiency, I grabbed 2 things. I grabbed calls handled. That's a really good one. Just how many calls did someone take? And the second one that I grabbed was average wrap time. That's a great contact center measurement. So how long are your callers spending in wrap on average? And then lastly, for ability, I grabbed total login time. That's a great way just to look at a time card. Hey, you're supposed to work 40 hours a week. Did you work 40 hours this week? And then for the more advanced call center applications, I grabbed percent release time. So again, we're using a little bit of Michelle's template. I'm going to come back to Michelle's story specifically a little bit later. There's some really interesting outcomes around her program, but we'll get there. Don't worry, we're coming back to that. So this is kind of my version of the STAR program. Again, I've got 5 here, but really I've got 3. You'd either run the kind of top 3 here or average handle time with wrap time and release time if you're a contact center or something like that. Again, not necessarily the metrics that you should use, but run with this example for me. From there, what you want to do is once you've got those metrics defined, you've identified your current stars. So again, a little bit of a cheesy thing here, but I talked about who's your top performer. Go and identify that person, figure out what their measurements are with regards to these metrics. And from there, start to set some benchmarks for your team. Now, this is one of the most important things that I really want to highlight for you within this is when you're setting the benchmark. So there's one step of choosing what you should measure, and that's where your current stars are going to be really helpful for you deciding what are you going to measure. But the next step is then figuring out, well, okay, now I know what to measure, but how and what do I set the goal around for that? And that's a really tricky thing to kind of define. So I mentioned, Michelle had in hers average handle time, they wanted that less than 190 seconds. So 190 seconds. How do they arrive at that number? And look, there's all kinds of ways that people arrive at these numbers out there in the real world. I talk to customers all the time that have defined benchmarks for their organization based on industry averages. So, hey, on average, agents in the healthcare industry answer calls in less than 60 seconds, or they handle calls in less than 120 seconds. Well, that's fine. That can be kind of an interesting starting point. But the truth is you really want to pay close attention to your own team, and you want to figure out, what are they capable of? Because that's great. The industry average might be 120 seconds, 2 minutes. But if your average handle time right now is 15 minutes, trying to get your agents overnight down to 2 minutes is going to be A, impossible, but B, it's probably going to be detrimental to your callers because they've gotten really used to these longer call times. And so those kinds of magnitude shifts have to happen over time. So when you're setting these benchmarks, I want you to be really careful. You've defined, okay, here's what I think I should measure. Here's what my best performer's doing. Here's where the rest of my agent pool is. You want to set benchmarks really intelligently in between. I'm going to flip my share screen over and talk to you kind of practically about this. We've been talking in theory about how you'd accomplish this. Let me actually flip over and show you some kind of real examples. So I'm going to flip to my web browser, share this. So this is for anyone who hasn't seen, I know I talked a little bit about who we are, Brightmetrics. This is the actual Brightmetrics application running on a real environment. This customer that I have here, they are a customer of ours that we've worked with for a fair amount of time. They've given us permission to use their data in circumstances like this. So as I take a look through this dashboard, this is a dashboard specifically built around a work group. I've got a variety of key stats kind of broken out around this work group. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of quickly drill down into one of these reports, and I'm going to spin this report that comes up here in a few different ways. I'm going to grab, we're talking about agents obviously, so I'm going to grab within this particular queue the party name, and then I'm going to pull on a measurement around these agents for that average handle time. I'm going to scroll down. Where's my average handle? Here we go. So I'm going to put average handle on here and then kind of collapse this away. And I've got a report here. So this is a group. I can see the average handle time for their team on average is 1 minute and 12 seconds. They've got at kind of a top level 1 minute and 39 seconds. They've got at a bottom level Sean, who's down at 54 seconds. Now, there's always that question of, is Sean the most proficient agent? Are callers satisfied with, having their calls handled in just 54 seconds, things like that. But ultimately, there's this big spread and this big divide between, almost 2 minutes and under 1 minute here. That's the example of the spread that you kind of want to look for and identify who's your top performer. Is it Susan? Is it Sean? Again, have that number in mind before you go look at this data. And from there, start to kind of set an idea. Okay, well, my team's at 2 minutes right now. I'd love to have them at 1 minute. But let's be honest, it's a 50% reduction. That's probably not going to happen overnight. And so I want you to think through this logically and kind of work through, okay, well, would it be beneficial for us if we made a slight step in that direction? You can always change the goal later on, but it's going to be much easier psychologically for your agents to wrap their heads around changes in these measurements that are quickly and easily attainable. So what I mean by that is if you want to get your pool down overall to that under 1 minute mark, maybe the starting point is, hey, we just want to see you guys get under 1 minute and 30 consistently. You've got a couple agents here that's average handle time is already under that. You've got one that's over that. If you can get everyone performing at under that, then after they've achieved that, you can step forward and say, okay, now we want it to be 1 minute and 20 seconds. And then 4 weeks later, let's make it 1 minute and 10 seconds and drive your way down there and monitor the results. You might actually hit a point where you say, hey, our goal is to get down under 1 minute, but then you get under 120 seconds and everything's working the way you want. The callers are really happy. You're efficient. You've solved some of the other problems you're working through, and you're happy with that number. There's a benefit to stepping your way to the metrics that you want. A, it'll be easier for your agents to swallow. It'll be easier for them to make those steps. It's much simpler for someone to look at a goal and say, okay, here's where I am today. Just a couple tweaks and changes, and I can make my way to that metric and that measurement, rather than trying to say, hey, I want you to make this humongous leap overnight. Guide them through that process step by step. And look, again, you want to set your benchmarks. You don't want to find a benchmark. If Sean is the best agent in terms of handle time here with 54 seconds, you don't want to set a goal to have calls under 30 seconds average handle time. That's unattainable for everyone. It's okay if you set a benchmark that Sean is naturally going to achieve. Sean's already the best performer in our example here. That's fine. Let Sean be the best performer. Don't try to set a benchmark that forces everyone to improve. If that person's already good, you don't need to force them to improve further. So that's kind of the way that you want to think through this. With whatever measurement you're paying attention to, take a look at the reports around that and see, okay, well, here's kind of where our group spreads, and here's, a goal that we think is relatively attainable for almost everyone in this group, and then start to drive them towards that measurement. I'm going to flip back to my slide deck now. I should say I haven't seen any questions come in, but if there are any questions, please don't hesitate to ask those things at any point. So the next step in this, you've defined, here's the measurements we want to pay attention to. You've spent some time working through what are the actual benchmarks and goals that we're going to set there. The next step is actually communicating this to your agents and how you're going to accomplish this. This is where we're really going to go back to this org chart. So where the last step, defining the benchmarks, that's really a responsibility typically of the executive team. The responsibility of communicating this program to the agents is going to be that kind of mid-level management, supervisors, managers. If it's a call center, typically a floor lead or a call center manager, something like that. If it's another team, that comes in a myriad of forms, sales manager, service manager, those kinds of roles. It's that team's job to actually make the communication to the agents to tell them, hey, here's the program that we're implementing. Now, here's what's really interesting about a gamification strategy and structure like this. In a lot of organizations that don't use gamification, that this mid-level management, this supervisor role, their job is really to be kind of this banging, blaring gong that is highlighting and shining on the imperfections and misperformance of a team. And what I mean by that is, they're doing performance reviews and talking to everyone about, hey, here's where you're not meeting up, here's what we'd like to see for the next quarter, and having those conversations. That's okay. I mean, that can be effective, but honestly, when you look at that, most of those kinds of organizations fall into a quarterly or a half-yearly kind of performance review plan. And what usually goes on in those meetings, if they're effective, is the conversations had about, hey, here's the performance expectations, here's what we'd like to see changed. And the agent walks out, or the employee walks out of that really, really excited about, hey, I want to achieve that. I want to walk into my next performance review having done everything that we just talked about. And you see for a couple of weeks a big behavioral change where all of a sudden their performance spikes way up and they're trying really hard because they were motivated. If that meeting went the way it was supposed to, it wasn't a negative thing, it was an encouraging thing. They were motivated and they were kind of driven towards success. But then after a couple of weeks, the kind of high of that whole, hey, I want to achieve and perform, that starts to wear off. And they start to kind of fall back into their routine of just the grind of the day-to-day job, and they kind of snap back into place. And then you come to the end of the quarter, a couple months after that, and they're back performing exactly the way they were before. And there's all kinds, it's like a wave that happens where it just crests and it falls off. And a lot of organizations fall into that trend and habit where they're consistently just kind of struggling as their team, will perform coming out of the review and then kind of fall back into place. And then they'll have that conversation over and over and over again, quarter after quarter. Gamification strategies can flip that on their head, because if you do this right, you've chosen some measurements, but the way to communicate those measurements to the team is not going to be through those performance reviews. It's going to be much more continuous than that. It starts with what we think the first thing you should do is build out a historical scorecard. What this is all about is giving transparent perspectives to your team on a regular basis. A historical scorecard is something that takes those 3 to 5 measurements, drops them into a report of some kind, and hands them over to the team, I would say, as a best practice, I think on a weekly basis. You package this together, you give it to the agent on a weekly basis so that they can look at it and see, okay, how did I do last week? The best time for this, if you want my opinion, is Monday mornings. Every Monday morning, have each agent receive a performance report for their previous week. What's that going to do? Well, they're going to look at that and they're going to see very clearly, okay, I know what the goals are. My handle time is supposed to be 190 seconds or less. What was it last week? It was 195. Okay, I didn't hit that goal. Why do you want to do that on Monday mornings? Well, a couple of things. A, you don't want to send people into the weekend depressed about their jobs. That's not a good thing, just from, that's an HR thing more than anything. But the other benefit to doing it on Monday mornings is that is going to drive motivation. They're going to look at that and see, okay, I didn't match up, or hey, I did it and I want to do it again. I met up and that's great. I feel really good. I want to keep my streak alive, that sort of a thing. If you do it on Monday mornings, they can take all that energy that's derived from seeing their performance from last week, and that motivation turns into real performance on Monday and carries through the week. So that historical scorecard is really, really valuable for something like that. I can show you an example. I've built one of these out, and one of the things that's really useful in Brightmetrics around this is we do scheduled reporting. So obviously packaging a report together might sound like a daunting amount of work and a ton of effort for a supervisor. It really isn't. With a system like Brightmetrics, what you can do is just build a saved report that automatically sends this out to the agents on a regular recurring basis. You can schedule it to deliver to them every Monday morning. So within this environment, I've got one saved in here. Let's see, where's my scorecard? Oh, you know what? I think I saved this one on the ECC. Yeah, there we go. So here's an example of my agent scorecard that I built out. This is a really simple one. In this case, I've got it broken out by month. I'm filtered to an individual agent here, A. Andrikin, a really active agent. I'm filtered to just a specific time period. And I can see for this agent, the total count of calls answered, the average in ECC handle time is called treatment time, the wrap time, the login time, the release percentage time. That's a report that we could package together. You could obviously change the formatting, and I always like to show agents more than just a single week. I like to show them kind of their rolling performance when we do this. So you might break it down by month. If your kind of performance periods are monthly, then you could show them, hey, here's how you're doing for this month versus the last few months. If you want to be a little bit more granular, you can even get down into the week specifically and drop that in there and let them see how their performance moves week to week. I'm a big fan of that granularity. The reason granularity is really, really useful there is it's easier for an agent to control their averages and their roll-up numbers in a shorter period of time. So it's easier for them to look at and see, okay, well, sure, I didn't meet up for the whole month of October, but I sure as heck can maybe make some changes and meet up for just a week and see how I did comparatively to last week. So the more granular the reporting period, the better. Again, there's nothing wrong. The most important thing is get something in front of them that shows them their performance. If that's monthly, that's fine. But you can get down to that kind of weak granularity like I have here. This is one I created this a couple of years ago and just saved it off. There were good numbers in this one, so I've obviously this is from 2017, but I liked the numbers that this agent exhibited during that time. So that's an example of that historical scorecard. Again, package that, deliver that. The one other thing that can be useful in there, and this is something where you really have to kind of decide your approach to gamification. There's two different schools of thought in gamification. There is providing gamification stats to an agent where you've set benchmarks and it's somewhat anonymous. They can see their own performance, but they can't see everyone else's. And maybe you're communicating to them, hey, 3 of our 15 agents made it into our STAR program over this period of time or something like that, but it's anonymous. Other organizations say, hey, we actually want them to see how they stack rank, where do they sit in the leaderboard. I'm a big fan of both. I mean, I think that absolutely you get a significant lift out of certain employees when they can see how they stack up against other people. There are people that are just competitive by nature, and so being able to show them, hey, you're currently 3rd out of 15, that those people are sometimes going to be the kind of people that say, well, but I want to be first, and they're going to work really, really hard on that. So whether you do this in an anonymous structure or you do it in a more open where everyone can see everyone else's format, you can be successful either way, but think through that as a part of your strategy when you're sending out those reports. If you're going to be transparent and let everyone see everyone else's performance, include that in there as well so they can see their own benchmarked against the rest of the team. It doesn't stop there, though. There's one other component that we think is really, really important here, and that's the actual real-time data. So the historical scorecard is a communication on a weekly basis of, hey, here's how you did last week. But even that can be a little bit narrow. You remember I give you that example of the quarterly performance review where for a couple weeks performance spikes up and then it drops off. It's really funny, even with that weekly scorecard, the same thing can start to happen. You can feed out that weekly scorecard and you can see someone from Monday and Tuesday really boost their performance, and then Wednesday hits and they just kind of start to slide a little bit and they're not performing quite as well as they were. So that's where kind of our third point comes into play. You also want some continual feedback that can be referenced throughout the day. And this is something that's really, really valuable in 2 places, but really this is something where that feedback loop is something that you want driven through the agents. So what do I mean by this? Well, what I would do practically here is actually put out to your agents a real-time dashboard that allows them to see their own performance benchmarked against the rest of the team. what that's going to do is if you put that, that's something that you can build and share with them individually, just give them a link that they can open on their own web browser, or it's something that you can actually put up on a TV. If you've got a wallboard, you can let them see their own performance balanced against one another up on a TV. You want this to be live, real, up to the minute data. Let me show you an example of one of these. I'm going to pull up, let me just pull up, I think this is a pretty good example of one here. So this dashboard is going to just kind of show me some simulated call volume. I can't always guarantee that this customer's on the phone, and as a matter of fact, they're on the Pacific Coast in the United States, so they're absolutely not on the phone. So this is some simulated call volume here that I'm pulling up. But this is a dashboard. Look, it's showing me queue, service level stats. So again, work group or ECC group being able to see things like, hey, there's 7 calls in queue. The one that's been waiting the longest and waiting 5 minutes. That's all valuable information for an agent to have just tactically. Hey, I need to make sure that I'm available right now to jump in and help out because things are kind of crazy. But then you can show them things like their average talk time or their average hold time or the number of calls that they've taken today. And you can actually sort charts like this by those measurements. So again, you could build out a real-time dashboard that contains some of these comparative stats within them and layer into an agent chart like this, those various performance measurements. And then they can look up and see, okay, I'm M. Burgundy. I've had 113 calls today. My average talk time is 48 seconds. I'm doing great. I'm just going to keep doing that. If I do that for 5 days in a row, I'm going to hit my numbers. If I'm somebody like BTO and I'm at 20 calls, I have a problem. Something's going on today. I'm not measuring up to the rest of the team here. My average talk time is at 3 minutes and 20 seconds. We want that under a minute. That's a great example of a way for someone to see what's happening. But you know what? It's not just the agents that see this. Look, it's really important that the agents see this and them being able to look up and see, hey, yeah, I'm really falling behind at the moment. It's also really important for the supervisors to have eyes on this. So remember, I said, hey, the supervisors are no longer the ones that are necessarily responsible for beating the agents over the head about their performance. When you do a successful gamification strategy like this, your supervisors become more of coaches within your organization. And what I mean by that is they're paying attention to views like I just showed you. And when they see something that's amiss, they can pop over to an agent and talk to them and have a conversation with them about, hey, what's going on today? Is everything okay? And look, there's all kinds of real world stuff that'll go on that will affect your agents. They might be having a rough day. Something might be going on with their kid at school, or, maybe they just lost a loved pet or something like that. That's the kind of things that you might see that truing out in data. And if you're only looking at that on a quarterly basis, it's going to just be a blip in the radar and you're going to lose sight of, well, what was actually going on. But if you're looking at the real-time data, your supervisor, that coach can kind of notice that and pop over to the agent and say, hey, what's going on? Have a conversation, kind of figure out, dig in, find out what's happening. And here's the real benefit of that. If you identify that a couple hours in the day or 4 hours in the day, you know what? That day might not be a top performance day for that agent, but if you can turn them around for the second half of the day, that is so much more valuable than if you'd identified that problem at the end of the week or at the end of the quarter. Because then they can be successful for half of their day. Whereas probably it's very rare for someone to come in and have a rough morning and without any kind of input or push or feedback, have a successful afternoon. It's probably going to be a bad afternoon, but your supervisors really can become those coaches in those situations that jump in and say, hey, what's going on? Talk to me a little bit. And then from there say, okay, well, that's fine. All right. That's the morning. But you know what? You've had a good week so far. A couple hours isn't going to kill your total numbers in our program for this week. See what you can do this afternoon. And if you turn that agent around, that is a huge win. That adds up a lot. If your supervisors really have a thumb on the pulse and pay attention to what's going on, that's going to have a humongous impact on your business over time. If you're kind of heading off those bad days a couple hours into them or 4 hours into them, rather than waiting until the end of the week or the end of the quarter to identify those sorts of things. Again, real-time operational picture. This is all about motivating agents to perform. We kind of talked about that and looked at a real example of that. This is a really good quote that we have from a live customer that works with us that I threw in here. Again, this is something that you'll find in the white paper. But Martin Hopley with a customer that we have out of Australia, the Mornington Peninsula Shire, said, yeah, we love to report historically, but the real value for us at the moment, where we're deriving a lot from Brightmetrics, is being able to put a dashboard in front of our team that can show exactly what's happening right now and everyone in the organization can see it, from the agents to the C-levels to the C-suite level. That's a really important thing too. If at all possible, I love to have those real-time perspectives up on TVs. Why? A, it's an easy way for an agent to look up, or a supervisor to look up and see what's happening. But B, it creates some community pressure, where an agent looks up at that, and if they see, like the agent that we were looking at, if they see that they're at the bottom, and they know, hey, you know who walks by this all day long? Yeah, the founder of the company or the CEO of the company. That has a humongous effect on their desire to not be at the bottom of that leaderboard. And so it is really, really valuable to have these things up, transparently available for everyone to see. And that's kind of what Martin's getting at here with his quote. I really, really liked talking to him when we interviewed him a couple of years ago for a case study. It was really fascinating to kind of hear the way that they've used that, just in a, hey, there's just an effect of having this as transparent data that not just the agents and their managers can see, but everyone in the organization can see. Okay, the last kind of thing in all of this is, what are the next steps around a gamification program? So let's say that you walk out of here really, really motivated. You say, yeah, I want to build out my own STAR program or a gamification program, and you've figured out what are some measurements. By the way, obviously, it's very hard for me to hone in and give you specifics in a webinar format like this about, hey, here's the measurements I think you should be using. I hope I've given you some good ideas and sparked some things for you. I am also, and the Blackstar team is also, always happy to have conversations with you about this. So if we can kind of help you and guide you towards the right metrics, that's something that's really easy to do on a one-on-one session where we look at some of your own data. So we're more than happy to do that and kind of work with you on what are the right things for yours. But here's two really key points in a gamification strategy. Don't build this program, set it up, and leave it in place permanently forever. You need to constantly be reviewing your program, and you need to be open to changing your definition of good. Let's say that you go and look at the 5 measurements that I put up in our STAR program: the average handle time, the number of calls held, the number of calls handled, taken, the release percentage, the total login time. Let's say that you take all of those and you define, hey, here's the ultimate goals. We might make some steps to get there, but our goal is that every member takes over 200 calls a day, that their average handle time is less than 130 seconds, and that their total login time is over 40 hours in the week, something like that. If you jump in and start kind of working your team towards those measurements, and you find one of two things: either you find that you've set a benchmark that is completely unattainable for them, be open to changing your definition of what's a success metric in that case. And on the flip side, you might also find that they easily attain a measurement when you put it in front of them. Also be open to changing your definition of good. What do I mean there? Well, let's take Michelle's example, the handle time. Michelle and their organization set their average handle time target at 190 seconds. That was very, very strategic in nature. They used a lot of data to feed in and figure out that number. But here's what they found. Initially, they implemented that program, and their team hit 190 seconds for the first 2 quarters of the year. And then the 3rd quarter of the year hit, the year that they implemented this, and all of a sudden their team couldn't hit 190 seconds. The team that Michelle managed was in an insurance company, and during the 3rd quarter of the year, they would deal with a specific type of claim that would come in as they approached year end that took significantly longer for their team to handle and deal with. And so during that 3rd quarter, their whole STAR program kind of got blown up because nobody could hit 190 seconds. It wasn't the agent's fault. They were still working really hard, but they were dealing with a different kind of call. And so when the team went back to the drawing board, what Michelle and her team decided is, you know what, during the 3rd quarter, we need to change our definition of good. 190 seconds isn't attainable, but you know what is? 210 seconds. And so they changed it. In the 3rd quarter of every year, their STAR program would flip, and it would go from 190 seconds to a goal of 210 seconds. That's a really great example of situational awareness. You want to pay attention to your team and get a feeling for, hey, have we set something that is unattainable for them at the moment? And if that's true, that's going to be really, really negative for your business if you let that go on for too long. If your team feels like they can't hit the measurement you've given to them, it's going to be a problem. So be open to changing. Hey, this is what I think's good in my head, but if it trues out that that's not possible, I need to figure out what is possible and make that the goal and that the target, or measure something else entirely differently. The inverse can be true as well. If you set a goal of 190 seconds and suddenly your team's performing at 150 seconds consistently, clearly your benchmark is a little bit too high. Your target is a little bit too high. The last thing I want to wrap up on is kind of tell you about, how do you package all of this together? So you've got an idea of the data structure behind this. What can you do with this? There's a lot of creative things you can do with this. I promised I'd tell you more about Michelle's STAR program. So what Michelle's team did is they packaged all of their measurements together into this program, and they went to their agents and their employees and said, hey, we've created this STAR program. We have 4 benchmarks. If you can achieve all 4 of these in a quarter, we will put you into our STAR program. What that means is you'll be a star within the organization. What does being a star equate to? It's a fancy name, cool, that's awesome. But the other thing that they did was said, hey, if you're in the STAR program, you'll make an extra $2 an hour. That's a lot of money when you average it out, kind of compared to the total salaries of the team. They said, we'll pay you an extra $2 an hour. So what happened? You'd think that overnight, everyone was performing at those metrics, but that's not actually what happened. The first quarter that they put it out there, they explained it to the team. There were about 5 to 10% of the agents that naturally were in that program without trying. They were the top performers to begin with. They did their jobs the way they always did their jobs, and they got into that program without even trying. So at the end of the quarter, that kind of natural 5 to 10% joined the program. The second quarter is where things got really, really fascinating for Michelle's team. In the second quarter, that 5 to 10% started talking to the rest of the organization over lunch breaks about, yeah, I'm making $2 extra an hour right now. Check out what I just bought. Or, hey, I'm going on this vacation next month. And they're talking about the extra money they had. And that network effect within the team, all of a sudden everybody else starts to work towards the same goal. By the end of the second quarter, Michelle's team had 50% adoption in their STAR program. They had 50% of their employees performing at that, and that number went up to, in the third and the fourth quarter, up into the 70 to 80, and I think ultimately at one point they even hit 90.25% of their team. Obviously, big call center, so big kind of network effect and change there. But that's really, really valuable. You need to give this thing enough time to breathe. You've got to let people kind of see what's going on. But you also want to figure out what's your incentive. Now, I understand you probably, a lot of organizations I talk to are like, yeah, well, that's great. I can't pay my team $2 extra an hour just for hitting a couple key benchmarks. Yes, I get that. Figure out something to tie to it. It doesn't have to be as big and as grand as that, but tie some kind of reward to it where, hey, if you consistently make it into this program or this level for a quarter or for a year, we're going to give you a gift card to Amazon at the end of it, or we're going to provide some kind of a benefit, or we're going to cater lunch or something like that. There's all kinds of things you can do there, and then let it breathe a little bit. Let the team kind of compete and kind of poke and prod one another and talk to each other about what they've gotten or what they've spent their Amazon gift card on or things like that. And it can have a really, really powerful effect. With that, recap, we talked about definitions. Gamification is all about reframing your organization so your agents are self-managing themselves and driving themselves towards efficiency. Your supervisors become much more of coaches in the organization. The way that you want to accomplish that is really practically figure out what are the benchmarks you pay attention to. Who are your top performers right now? What makes them special? That's a really good place to start with that. Again, something we'd be happy to help with as well and talk to you about. Communicate that to your team. Give them both a weekly historical scorecard, preferably Monday mornings is my feeling on that, where they can see, hey, how did I do last week? And then can try to drive their performance for the coming week. And then also give the organization a transparent view of how everyone's stacking up so that the members throughout the week can kind of see, hey, here's where I am, here's what I need to do to hit my targets, so my scorecard looks good at the end of the week, and package all of that into, together into a gamification program. It is a phenomenal way to drive agent and employee productivity within your team. with that, we've come to the end. I will open it up for questions, and if you have questions, type them in. While I do that, I know we're coming up on time. Dylan, I'll let you, I know you have a couple things you wanted to cover as well, so I'll turn it back over to you as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Peter. Some really good takeaways there. Personally, the part about the visible data and the CEO seeing the data, as well as changing people's behavior and incentivizing agents, some really good takeaways there. And just on that note, thanks everybody for taking the time out today to partake in the webinar. After the webinar, we're going to send you out a white paper, which is the secrets of employee performance. And that just gives you some of the screenshots of what is spoken about today that you can put in front of those stakeholders, or implement in your business if you already have Brightmetrics. We'll also be sending out a link to this recording of the webinar. If you had any colleagues that couldn't make it, feel free to share this with them. And just to recap, for those people who came late to the webinar, this is part 2 of a 3-part webinar series. If you missed the first one, head over to our YouTube channel, just search Black Star Solutions, and you'll find the first webinar there. And what we'll do is we will send you details of when the 3rd and final webinar will be. And yeah, please join us for that. There'll be some extra information and some really good takeaways on that. Just a few things to add. If you don't have Brightmetrics at the moment and are thinking of implementing it, we can do a 21-day free trial. So please get in touch with Steve. His email is steve, S-T-E-V-E, @blackstarsolutions.co.uk, and get in touch with him and we can look at implementing that. You can try the new Radiance UI and see whether it works in your organization, implement some of the points that Peter spoke today about, and then we can activate that after your 21 days has lapsed. Yeah, like I say, do get in touch with us. If you have any further questions after the webinar, unless you want to put them to Peter now. And yeah, we'd be more than happy to help you out. Again, thank you for your time. Over to you, Peter.
Excellent. Thanks, Dylan. I don't see any questions, so I will say thank you as well. I always appreciate and never take it lightly that people come and listen to me talk for an hour. So I hope this was beneficial and interesting and useful. As Dylan mentioned, would love to talk to you more about Brightmetrics or about gamification or really anything. If you're interested, that 21-day trial is a great kind of intro to an avenue to have that conversation. If you get that trial up and running, we can do a demo and kind of walk through some of these topics from your own data and actually take a look at what are some of the metrics that might be interesting for you to pay attention to. So if that'd be interest, please feel free to reach out. I've got both Steve and I's contact information up here on the screen. Feel free to reach out to either one of us. We'll pull each other in as needed. With that, I will just say again, thank you to everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll look forward to speaking with you soon.